KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger, a public affairs program featuring stories from all over the Central Valley with Sevag Tateosian, 90.7 KFSR.
Welcome to another edition of the Central Valley Ledger. We're recording out of the beautiful downtown Fresno studios of the Community Media Access Collaborative, Fresno and Clovis. We're not too far from the newly opened Fulton Street. It used to be a Fulton Mall. Now it's a street. And we're not too far from an area that was known as Old Armenia Town. Why am I bringing up Armenia Town? Because our guest this week is Professor Barlow Der Mugdrechian. He's with the Armenian Studies program, and today we're going to be talking about predominantly the Armenian Genocide, but we'll also touch some other Armenian topics. Professor, always a pleasure.
Good to be here.
You're our expert when it comes to Armenian issues. You've been doing this for a very long time. Tell us how long you've been a professor in Armenian Studies.
Well, I started back in 1985 with the Armenian Studies program. After I finished graduate school, I came back to Fresno State and began to teach with Professor Kyumjan. Then he retired in 2008, so I became the director of the program since 2008. So I think it's 34 years.
Congratulations on that. Not a lot of people can say that in the teaching field they've done this for that long. In the city that you were from, right? Fresno's where you're from.
Yeah, that's right. It's always good to be in the city that you're from.
This area is not too far from Old Armenian time. For early on, there was a lot of Armenians settled in this area. Do we know when they came to the Fresno area?
Well, our Armenians first settled permanently beginning in 1881, according to records that most people agree on. First Armenians came in 1881, and then they began to come in larger numbers following that. Before the genocide and right after the Armenian massacres of 1895-96, thousands of Armenians came. It was the mother community of Armenians in California. So most Armenians that have lived in California for, let's say, 4 or 5 generations can trace their ancestors back to Fresno as the first stop, and then they moved out maybe later to the Bay Area or to Los Angeles.
Professor, we always say that the Armenian Genocide occurred on April 24th, 1915. But that wasn't the first day that Armenians were getting massacred, correct?
April 24th is generally a symbolic day, but it has a real meaning behind it. And that real meaning is that in the capital of the Ottoman Empire, more than 230 Armenian leaders were arrested and sent to their deaths. So that's the reason of April 24th. But if you look at the broader picture of what we call the genocide, already Armenians were being targeted, especially those males that were serving in the army, as early as February and March of 1915. So it was only the symbolic date, but real date, but it started earlier and of course lasted all the way through the 1920s, early 1920s.
Professor, for people who haven't read about the Armenian Genocide, it's kind of tough to understand the atrocities that occurred. I mean, we're not talking people saying you have to move. We're talking murderers. We're talking all kinds of things, correct?
And generally speaking, when you say the word today, genocide or massacre, you're talking not only about forced deportation, which was a predominant way to eliminate the Armenians, primarily the women and children, but also the outright massacres. And that means that people were just simply taken out on the road and designated spots were massacred by the local population. So if you look at the very specifics of the genocide, it is a horrific series of actions, and really those people that survived were marked by that for the rest of their lives.
This is not an easy topic, yet year after year you teach about it. You take your students to Armenia. I've been on that trip. It's a great trip. You take them to the Genocide Monument. It's a dark history, but you teach about it. Why?
I think it's part of the history of the Armenians. It's not everything in Armenian history. We need to know about the genocide because it tells us about where the Armenians are in the world. That's why there are so many Armenians outside of what is today the Republic of Armenia and historic Armenia. So if you go back before the genocide, there was at least 2,500 years of Armenian history. So to teach the genocide also teaches us about the survivability of the Armenians, the way that Armenians were able to survive the Armenian genocide, although it was a very difficult path.
When people talk about Armenians, they bring up Christianity. just here in this area, there are 4 or 5 churches. Christianity was important to the Armenians. Why?
Well, it became important after they officially converted in the 4th century, so almost 1,800 years ago, Armenians became Christian, and it marked them as being a separate people, separate because most of the population areas that they were living in on one side were Christian Orthodox, like the Byzantines, but then the Arabs were there, the Arab Empire, and later Persian Empire, later Turkish Empire, which were Muslim. So being a Christian marked them with a very special history. The religious beliefs, obviously, for the Armenians were very important. They have stayed very close to the Apostolic Church, which is sort of the mother church of the Armenians, although there are Armenian Protestants as well. And it has remained as part of their identity. So if you look at most aspects of Armenian culture, it has somehow been influenced by the Armenian Church. I'm thinking of music or art, for instance.
At Fresno State, for the genocide, the students put together a program. It's been like that ever since I was a student and years before then. Tell us what people can expect on April 24th at noon at Fresno State.
The Armenian Students Organization, for more than 40 years, has been organizing genocide commemoration activities. We used to do it in the free speech area because that was kind of the central area, but once the Armenian Genocide Monument was completed in 1915, the proper place to do it now is right in front of the monument. And typically what happens is that they invite guest speakers. They typically have some of the students themselves, the Fresno State students, tell stories about their own family experience with the genocide. And then there's usually some kind of musical interlude where some of the younger students, they play traditional Armenian music or sing. And then there's the laying of carnations or flowers on the monument, which is done at the end of the ceremony. So usually it's about a 35 to 45-minute ceremony presentation. It's well attended, and it's really, I think, very important for the students, not only the Armenian students, but for everyone at Fresno State.
You've been doing that for years. You've been at that event for years. Does it still touch you?
Yes, of course. It can't fail to touch you. I mean, if you have some feeling for who you are as an Armenian, coming to the Genocide Monument especially, everyone who pretty much visits that monument has the same sort of impression of it as a place of memory, as a place of inspiration. So to me also to see new generations continuing in the path, to me is satisfying.
Some people, you hear this often, think that the new generation doesn't care about history. They just care about themselves. I'm generalizing, obviously. Are you seeing that people are caring, in particular the students, are caring about this history?
I think it's true that every generation sort of recreates itself, so every generation has to find its way to express itself. The younger generation is influenced by things that are different than my generation or even your generation, so we still see their participation, their organization, that is their interest in the history of the Armenians by attending lectures or participating in the club activities. And every year they prepare t-shirts, very nice t-shirts, which commemorate the genocide, and also they prepare the program. And so in that way, they are also passing on the torch to future generations.
You mentioned lecture, and you had a real big one recently, Professor Taner Akçam. Mm-hmm. He's a Turkish professor, non-Armenian.
Right.
He was in Fresno. What was he talking about? And the concept of his book, how important was that to unveil?
Our guest was Dr. Taner Akçam. He's the chair of the Armenian Genocide program at Clark University, that's in Worcester, Massachusetts. So he had been researching the Armenian Genocide for several decades, actually, and has published voluminously, lots of books. But last year he published a book called The Killing Orders of Talat Pasha, which re-examined the issue of the orders. Is there any written evidence of the Armenian Genocide? Can we find orders actually in the Armenian Genocide? Most of those were found in a coded format, and what he explained in his lecture, which was his book, was how today's Turkish state tries to still deny the Armenian Genocide, although the evidence for the genocide is in those documents, which although were coded, were able to be decoded. So he explained how that was done in that process, and in that way brought new light to the Armenian Genocide.
Do you think that his book takes the argument that the genocide was a systematic government, Ottoman Turkish government move to the next level? I mean, does it help the argument that people have been making all along that the genocide occurred because it was ordered by the Ottoman Turks?
Yes, this book, but also previous books as well. I don't think there's going to be one book that you can say is overwhelmingly positive in the sense of being the one book to prove the Armenian genocide. But the thesis of his book is that Turkey today denies this Armenian genocide and that there was an Armenian genocide. So I think it very positively asserts that. And in his speech and in his presentation, Dr. Akçam was very clear about that.
I watched one of his lectures on YouTube about this book, and my favorite part of the lecture was people keep asking, where's your evidence? Here's the evidence. So your thoughts, did his book make the case?
Well, again, it's not the only one. I mean, if those people that are familiar with the literature of the Armenian genocide, both historiography, meaning people who write histories, there are multiple books out on the marketplace that already give you an idea that, yes, what happened is the Armenian genocide. His takes a very specific area, and it smashes the Turkish denialist argument. So it kind of is more of a historical book, but it also takes a political action because it's basically somebody can use that book to show that the government is lying, the Turkish government is lying when they say there's no genocide.
Today, the stance of the Turkish government is there was no genocide at all, although they've admitted that some things happened, correct? I'll let you explain. One year, we heard Erdogan make a statement. Is he apologetic, or how would you categorize Erdogan's statements?
Well, it's a complex issue, but basically once he became prime minister and today president, what he has done is to open up Turkish society to at least some discussion of what happened in World War I. The way the Turkish government frames it and the way that he frames it is to say that there were many lives lost in World War I. So what he tries to do is to equate the loss of Turkish Muslims with those of the Armenians. But that's an incomplete assessment, and I think it's a wrong comparison because clearly the Turkish government was responsible for the Armenian deaths, whereas Turks who died, for the most part, was as a consequence of World War I. We see that in Turkey today. It is possible to actually hold Armenian genocide commemorations in Istanbul, the capital, and in other places, in the capital of Ankara, but really in Istanbul, Armenians are able to do that. So there has been a change, but the official government view and his view is that everyone suffered. He says, why don't anybody talk about the Turkish suffering? But that's an incomplete statement because Turkey was the aggressor and the perpetrator of the genocide.
This is going to be a hard question for you to answer because I don't know if you've looked at it in this way, but can you quantify the loss of the Armenians in dollar signs? We're talking human loss, generation loss, gold loss. The churches lost a lot of valuables in gold. And by loss, I mean they were pillaged and they were taken. Is there a number? How would you answer the question of what price tag could you put on the loss of the Armenians?
Well, I think you'd have to say it's pretty much incalculable because of all the things that you mentioned. You know, insurance companies can put a value on a human life, but I don't think that that's been done back in 1915 to try to go back and say, well, one Armenian's life is worth X amount of money. Even the homes and all of those other kinds of things, there have been studies and books written about this question, but none of them is sort of a complete reconstruction of this question of how much money is there or should there be. One example might be the case of the Armenian insurance policies that were taken out in World War I, and then there was a lawsuit to try to force the insurance companies to pay the survivors, and there was a certain price tag put on it. But that was only one small part of the whole dimension of the Armenian genocide. If you calculate all the homes lost, the businesses lost, the human life, you would be in the billions of dollars for sure in today's money.
Is this still an open wound? I hear the phrase all the time about this issue for Armenians being an open wound. Could you categorize it that way, or would you categorize it that way?
Well, I think open wounds are those that haven't been healed, and the way to heal the Armenian genocide would be if Turkey did acknowledge the Armenian genocide. But I think many Armenians have moved on, not that they've forgotten the genocide, but they're able to go on with their lives, and they're able to still commemorate the Armenian genocide. It's got to be a wound because those people that have survived have had grandparents or great-grandparents go through it, and they've heard that stories. So every time they hear the story, it's painful. So it is an open wound. And if someone tells you that your grandparents were not killed, but they simply died as a result of something else. But when you know that they were killed by soldiers, then it's still an open wound. So that's what's keeping the wound festering.
If I were to go to my great-grandparents' home right now in historic Armenia, Eastern Turkey, and knock on the door and say, this is my property, again, this might be a tough question for you to answer, but what do you think the person living in that house would say? Do you think they know that this occurred and that they're living in stolen property?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question because there were so many different kinds of cases of people appropriating property. So first of all, in some smaller towns or villages, everyone in the village knows what happened, and they would have that historical memory of whose house was whom, and so they may remember. If you go to a bigger place, into a city today, if a building has gone through 3 or 4 sets of hands, the newest owner may only know that the last owner, who that was, and they wouldn't have any interest to know what it was 100 years ago, just as many people here wouldn't know what a building was 100 years ago. So it's difficult for people to figure out exactly that, and they don't feel guilty for it, I don't think. And maybe they shouldn't feel guilty, but they should feel guilty as a nation that denies the genocide.
Could there be tracing? Again, I'm asking you some tough questions in this interview. Could there be a possibility of tracing to try to find where someone's grandparents or great-grandparents lived?
Well, I think if that family still has a map and they have some very good information about oral history, their grandparent or that survivor told them where they lived, it's possible still to identify certain places. But again, 100 years has gone past, and so even in a place like Fresno, if you want to find things that are older than 50 years or 60 years, we find that often they've been demolished and replaced with older buildings or newer buildings. And so I think it would be hard to identify all of those Armenian areas. The main thing are churches, of course. So wherever you see an Armenian church, tells you that there was an Armenian community. And if there's no people left today, but the church remains, it tells you what happened to those people.
Tell us a little bit about your grandparents. And they're from Vaughan. There's a beautiful church in Vaughan, and that church is open for people to go visit. Has all Armenianness of that church gone away? In essence, if I went to that church as a tourist, will I see that this church is Armenian anywhere?
You won't see, this is the Church of Akhtamar you're referencing, which is on the island of Akhtamar in the region of Lake Van. The church was renovated and reopened, but the Turkish government doesn't say who owned it or who built it.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Yeah.
Doesn't that hurt? Isn't that the wound that I'm talking about? The fact that you know that this is your grandparents' church. You know it's an Armenian church because there's Armenian letters. You know there's Christian symbols. Doesn't that hurt to say, for someone to say, oh no, this is a historic Turkish church?
Well, I just take it as someone maybe who's ignorant and they don't know, and then this is government policy, so I'm not hurt by it in that sense. What I want to do is to shed light on it so that people do learn the true history of it, and it will be seen as what it is. Now, today it's only open once a year for church services, so you can go in it as a tourist, but you can't have a church service in there, and even though it was an Armenian church.
So do you think people know, like people who go visit the church as tourists, do you think that most of them know that this is an Armenian church they're going to? Is this like that unspoken whisper type of thing?
Well, I think most of the tourists who are either Armenians from the outside of Turkey, from Armenia, or Europeans actually do know the history of it because the travel books talk about it. You know, it's not a secret. So I think if you read about places you go to before you go, you're going to know about it. Maybe a local Turkish people wouldn't know about it, but they also know it's not Turkish because it's a church, it's not a mosque, and that by definition then would mean that it's Armenian at that time in that place.
So there's an evening service on April 24th as well. The day has a flag raising in the morning at City Hall, then another student event at the Genocide Monument at Fresno State, then the evening service. Tell us about the evening service.
Well, in Fresno, there's been since the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, an Armenian Genocide Commemorative Committee, which is represented by organizations and churches in the Fresno area. And their purpose is really to organize and put on these annual commemorations. So they're going to be having a service Between 6 and 6:45 p.m. at the monument on April 24th, people can come and place flowers on the monument. 6:45, there'll be the singing of national anthems and raising of flags. At 7 o'clock, there'll be a religious service, a half-an-hour religious service conducted by the clergy. Then at 7:30, there will be a civic presentation, which will include remarks by Fresno State President Dr. Joseph Castro, and then actually some young people who are participating in an essay contest. The winners are going to be asked to present at the monument.
That's a cool little addition there, the essay contest.
Yeah, I think it's different because you'll get actually young people who really talk about their own feelings and about what they've researched, rather than have someone just get up and give a speech, which is kind of difficult to do after so many years.
So April 24th comes, there are different events for April 24th. And then what? So you have lectures, I presume, year-round, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So people can go to those lectures and find out more at your website?
Well, they could find out about the Armenian Genocide in particular.
Genocide and other Armenian topics.
Sure. So we have the Armenian Studies program has a lecture series. It's an annual lecture series, which includes showing of films, conferences, and other kinds of activities. This academic year, we've had 27 activities that we've
That's
planned.
impressive.
Yeah, it is very impressive. And so it includes things like conferences, and we try to live feed these to Facebook or YouTube so that people can see these videos, even if they weren't able to make them. And then they can always see about our upcoming events and come and attend some of the wonderful events. There's just a wide variety of topics that are covered.
You mentioned President Castro earlier. I have to say that he's been very supportive of events, the Genocide Monument, Armenian Studies Banquet. He's been there every year that I remember.
Yeah.
How supportive is President Castro?
Well, he's been very supportive of both the community and the Armenian Studies program in particular, and that means that he speaks well of us. He's interested in our activities. He attends our banquet. He attends other activities. There's an Armenian Leadership Council now that he has put together that gives him advice for the university on a university level. So he's gotten to have very good contacts with the Armenian community, and he's an easy person to talk to. So he has made a good impression on the community, and I think he's been an asset not only to the university but for the community.
Every year you have a banquet. Students get scholarships. There's always a nice program,
Right.
a nice dinner. This year you had a packed house.
Right.
I've never seen that many people at your banquet.
Right.
Talk about that. Was this the most you've ever seen?
I think so. We had close to 270 people attend our banquet, and in the facility that we were using, that was considered full. There really wasn't much space to walk around, and so we were very happy. That's primarily due to the fact that we gave out 60 scholarships, 60 different students received individual scholarships, and so they brought their family and friends, plus support from other people in the community. Turned out to be a really nice event. We had a special guest who was the Consul General of the Republic of Armenia in Los Angeles, Dr. Armenian Baburtian, and so it put together, it was a very impressive event, primarily because the community gets to see the students, and in that way gets to get closer to our program.
Professor, so for people out there who are listening to this show who are not Armenian, and they say, well, why is the Central Valley Ledger talking about this? This happened so long ago. People should just forget and move on. Why hold this grudge? How do you answer that question?
Well, I think it's not healthy to just forget things and to cover them up. So I think it's good to talk about things, and for Armenians themselves to always talk about their culture and their history, which includes the Armenian Genocide. So yes, we live in America. We're very proud of living in America. It's given us opportunity to prosper, both spiritually and physically, materially. And it gave us an opportunity, a new home, which we were secure in. And it also gives us an opportunity to look back and to say that, there was a wrong committed, and we want to right that wrong. And we are insisting that by pursuing justice in the Armenian case, we're pursuing justice for other people throughout the world who have suffered similar types of actions throughout the 20th century.
Talk about the newspaper put out by students. When I was a student, I was editor of it.
Right.
It's called the High Sharjum. It still goes out. and it goes out to a lot of people.
Right.
Tell us about that newspaper.
Well, there's a newsletter or newspaper which is part of the Fresno State Collegian, and it's called Hai Sharjum, Armenian Action Newspaper. This year's its 40th year of
congratulations.
publications. Yeah, it's 1979 to 2019. And it reflects the activities of our program and our students, and it's sent out primarily to the region, but also to the United States, people in the United States and overseas. And they have become familiar with our program and our activities, and it really is a way to stay in touch with the community.
How can people find out more information about your program? Do you have a Facebook website?
Yeah, we have several websites that people might find interesting. One is simply the Armenian Studies program page, and that is found at fresnostate.edu/Armenian Studies, and that will be our main page. It shows our upcoming events, talks about our program, the classes, etc. We also have a Facebook page, which is Armenian Studies Fresno State, which is also basically about our events. So all of our events, upcoming events, are posted. And then we have a variety of other ways for people to stay in touch.
And then if they want to call the office, what's the office number?
Our office number is 559-278-2669. People can call. We're staffed not every hour of every day, but we're there quite a bit. And people can call and ask questions.
Professor, I could talk to you for hours and days about the different things in the program, but we'll talk again next time.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. That's all for this edition of the Central Valley Ledger. We hope you enjoyed the program this week. Thank you to our volunteer crew that make this production and every production possible. Our director was Paul Starcevic, and our associate producer was Xavier Urarty. We hope you enjoyed the program. To those listening to us on KFSR 90.7 FM and to those watching this broadcast on CMAC, Comcast 93 and AT&T 99. Tune in next time to a new edition.
KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger every Sunday morning at 11:30. For a complete program schedule, visit kfsr.org.